So, hi all, and welcome to our usual seminar. And today we are very happy to host Professor Marcelo Mattar. Marcelo is a computational neuroscientist whose work lies at the intersection of reinforcement learning, memory, and decision-making. His research combines behavioral experiments with computational modeling to understand how humans learn from experience, plan for the future, and use memory to guide their choices. His work has appeared in the very top journals and has contributed to our understanding of how cognitive processes support adaptive behavior. Here is to your question. We will proceed as usually with about 45 minutes for the talk, about 15 minutes for questions, and then the formal part will be over and we will stay for about additional 15 minutes or so for the informal discussion if it's fine with you. Marcelo, thank you very much for joining us. And now the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yefin. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to talk about my work with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about this work I've done with Jian Li, who was a grad student in my lab at UCSD, and Marcus Bena, who is a collaborator, a professor of neuroscience at UCSD and a collaborator on this project. So the questions that will ground this talk are probably very common questions in the field and questions that many of you are also interested in exploring, namely, how do our brains decide what to do? What are the underlying internal processes? And finally, how do we scientists figure that out? Of course, these are big questions in the field. I'm not going to propose to solve them completely, but I hope I will at least show a new direction we could go about answering them. And to answer those questions, we begin by viewing this problem, the problem of decision-making, from the perspective of the individual who is embedded in an environment. So this agent may observe the state of the environment through observations, and in turn will act in that environment as a result of those observations, in turn leading to new observations and potentially rewards. Now, to understand this process, we scientists, we assume that the agent has some kind of internal state, which specifies their beliefs, their preferences over different actions that they might take, their preferences over different kinds of rewards that they might take, that they might acquire. And this internal state is really critical. We're going to represent this with this variable ht. And this internal state, in turn, will, so this internal state is going to be updated with a function that depends on the previous internal state at the last time point, as well as incoming information, incoming sensory observations, as well as incoming rewards. So we can imagine that this ht is constantly evolving in time. And then in addition to that, we also have a function g of ht, which specifies how the individual will act in the environment. So this policy pi will be a function of the internal state. Therefore, the internal state is updated, specifying what the agent believes at any moment in time, and then that in turn specifies their actions. So today I'm going to claim that really the job of cognitive science, for the most part, is devoted to characterizing these two functions, f and g. We've made tremendous progress in the field. For example, I'm going to give two very simple examples, although I could go on and on exemplifying how much of the field is devoted to characterizing these two functions. But maybe just to warm us up, reinforcement learning is a classic example here. We can think of reinforcement learning as specifying the agent's beliefs over the qualities of different actions. These qualities are specified by this function q, and the policy of the agent is in turn a function of these quality functions. Here we commonly use the softmax function over these q values. And therefore, our goal as scientists, when we feed a model, for example, is to try to specify the details of this Q update function by feeding the learning rate, and the details of the softmax function by fitting this beta softmax temperature to really understand both how the internal states evolve and the actions are specified. Another example we have here is Bayesian inference over actions. In this case, when we try to infer the internal state of the agent, we're trying to assess what are the agent's beliefs over which action is best, and we can assume that those beliefs are updated with incoming information using Bayesian inference, which is the statistically optimal way of doing those updates. And again, we can specify a linking function linking their beliefs to choices, for example, the softmax temperature. And I will say, like, both of these examples, and as I said, we could give many more, are great simple stories that we understand, and that does a pretty good job at capturing behavior in the environment by animals and humans. But the question I'm going to pose today is, what if those models are not the full story? Or what if there is something else? Maybe they're approximately right, but not 100% right. To move forward, I'm going to list here and contrast two different approaches for modeling learning decision making. So we have this classic cognitive models, like the two examples I just gave. They have this advantage of being very simple. They have few parameters. They lead to very interpretable models. They're typically based on normative principles or hypothesized mechanisms. So we come in with like a priori hypothesis of optimality or over some particular mechanism that could be inspired by neural mechanisms, for example. And then when we find any discrepancy between what these models achieve and what the data shows, we often augment these models with additional assumptions. For example, may augment the classic reinforcement learning model with some kind of forgetting function. May augment it with a perseveration function. And iteratively, this augmentation process gradually improve the fits, and we may feel like we're getting closer and closer to what the ground truth model inside the mind of the participant is. The caveat here is that these models will always have limited flexibility to capture realistic behavior. They always depend on the creativity of the researcher that specifies the functions a priori, and therefore they're also prone to researcher subjectivity. The contrasting approach that I'm going to propose today is based on neural networks. These neural networks are highly flexible. They have many parameters. And in fact, they're often called function approximators. So if your goal is to find the f and the g function that specifies human behavior, you might very well think that it's reasonable to use a function approximation approach. They require very few structural assumptions, not zero, but I would say they're infinitely more flexible than classic models. They also have excellent prediction of behavior and neuroactivity with very minimum handcrafting. Of course, and finally, they can be used across domains, including vision, navigation, memory, learning, planning. They can be used to explain neuroactivity and so on. So it's all great, except that there is a big caveat. The caveat is that the fitted model is often a black box that can be hard to interpret. So we may think, looking at this parallel here, that the neural networks have great advantages, but it's a non-starter if it's a black box that we cannot interpret, if our goal is to understand the underlying processes behind cognition. So today, I hope I will show you how we might be able to get the benefits of neural networks and still be able to interpret, maybe not as easily as a cognitive model, but to a large degree, you retain some interpretability. And the idea behind our model is to show, or our approach is to show, that there are great similarities between using cognitive models and neural networks. This may seem trivial to many of you who have been working closely in the field of cognitive modeling, but I would say it's certainly not trivial to everyone. It wasn't trivial to me when I started working on this project. I thought, for a moment, I thought it was trivial to everyone else, and then I realized maybe it wasn't. And it's this idea that a cognitive model is essentially a dynamical system with state variables that evolve in time. In a reinforcement learning model, for example, you can imagine that you have an input layer that specifies the agent's last action, the agent's last state or current state, or the agent's rewards. These all go to a hidden layer which has invisible immeasurable quantities that evolve in time. For example, in the case of reinforcement learning model, this would be the Q values or the V values if you're specifying the state values directly, or posterior beliefs if you're dealing with a Bayesian model. And the output is going to be a probability of action. So very much like I described in the beginning. But what was interesting to me is that there's actually a direct parallel to what a neural network, to how a recurrent neural network model works. Namely, you also have an input layer, you also have an output layer, and you also have a hidden layer with dynamical variables. These are, in the case of the neural network, they are literally the activity of the hidden units, H1, HT for the first unit, HT for the second unit, all the way to the last unit. So we can think of these hidden units in the neural networks as really being a parallel or providing a direct parallel to these internal state variables in a cognitive model. And therefore, each model, we can, if this is the case, then what we have is that each model, each variant of a cognitive model or each neural network will actually have a distinct update rule for the dynamical variables. Namely, we'll use a different function f that specifies how these internal variables h or v are updated at every time point. And by seeing it in this way, you can imagine that now you might be able to fit a neural network instead of fitting a cognitive model, and then literally just look at how these internal state variables evolve in time and try to interpret them very much like we would interpret a cognitive model, except that we have the extra flexibility that these variables h are evolving according to a learned function instead of a pre-specified function. So with that, we ask, can we combine the flexibility of neural networks with the interpretability of cognitive models? And to show you that, I'm going to start, and the talk is going to start from like a very simple example, very simple examples, and we're going to grow in complexity as we go. But first, I'm going to say one type of neural network that makes that perhaps draws the closest parallel to a classic cognitive model, for example, one based on Bayesian inference, would actually be a one-unit neural network. That sounds really crazy to think about when we think about neural networks, because in the field, neural networks have been largely large models, right? Like the whole point of using neural networks is that we want to throw massive amounts of data at the problem, and then you do function approximation with these large data sets and learn very complex functions. However, drawing on this parallel that I just described, where, for example, a cognitive model may have a single internal state variable, such as the probability that action A is the best, then we might imagine that the equivalent neural network would be a recurrent neural network with a single unit. And the single unit is updated by a function f that depends on its previous state, as well as the input variables. And much like in the Bayesian inference model, you have a scalar variable specifying the internal state, except that this function is learned. And we can also imagine a two-unit neural network, which would have two internal variables, for example, specifying the decoupled values of action A and action B, such as in a reinforcement learning model, but again, using the added flexibility of a neural network. So our argument is that the low dimensionality of these models facilitates the interpretation using dynamical systems too. And a critical aspect of the interpretability is that by using a one or two unit neural network, it enables us to directly contrast the function that has been learned by these RNNs with the ones that are pre-assumed by a reinforcement learning or a Bayesian model. And this is what I'm going to hope to show you today. Is this clear to everyone? Does anyone have any questions at this point?
Yeah, it's clear, thanks, but I do have a question.
Okay.
Does this imply that so you only limit the input layer to one step back, or I'm missing something?
No, that's exactly right. So the input is the instantaneous input, that the agent receives, much like in a reinforcement learning model, the Q values, they're updated at every moment in time by the instantaneous reward that the agent receives. That doesn't mean that the internal states or the beliefs of the agent are only a function of the instantaneous variable, because you have this recurrence. And the recurrence enables you to integrate the input information over an arbitrarily large number of time points.
Okay, see, thanks.
So really, the point I want to drive home here is really that these models are really direct analogs of classic cognitive models. The difference is that in a classic cognitive model, this function is assumed based on statistical, optimal statistics, for example, or learning theory. And in a recurrent neural networks, they are learned from data. But you lose nothing by moving. You lose some degree of interpretability. I don't want to pretend that there is nothing that you lose, because you're going from a simple mathematical form to a much more complex mathematical form. But you don't lose the ability to capture any pattern in the data that you could capture with classical models. Any other questions? Okay, so this is the philosophy behind the approach. We're going to move on now to some examples. And the first examples I'm going to show, actually, the majority of the examples I'm going to show come from 6 tasks. And in fact, I think these are already 8 distinct data sets in which we tested our approach. So these are 6 commonly studied tasks. So many of those are probably familiar to you. This is a classic reversal learning task. We studied this in a data set with monkeys and another data set with rats. We have a 2-stage task, very classic task as well, used with humans and animals. In this case, we had a data set with rats and one with mice. We had a variant of the 2-stage task called transition reversal 2-stage task. I will expand the details of this task later on. And we also had 3 human data sets, a 3-armed reversal learning task, a 4-armed drift bandit task, and the original 2-stage task with humans. There is a particular reason why we use each one of these tasks that I'm going to expand a little bit on later. But the point so far is that we actually could apply this tiny RNN approach to all of these different data sets. And then we fit the data set, each one of these data sets with RNNs of varying sizes. We always fit the RNNs to single individual subjects. This is not this is by design. We did so because our underlying assumption is that the animals, our whole point here is to explain behavior that cannot be explained by normative models. And as soon as we allow for each individual to deviate from the normative benchmark, then we have to allow for the fact that each individual deviates in a distinct way. So for us, it was really important that we could actually fit these RNNs to each individual subject. And we did so first to test the performance of our approach. We did so with RNNs of varying sizes. We started with an RNN with 1 unit, an RNN with 2 units, and then 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And we compared the performance, the predictive performance, namely the quality of the fits, with over 30 classical cognitive models. And of course, because we're dealing with neural networks that are very prone to overfitting, we used an approach called nested cross-validation. So we take the whole data set, we split them into 10 folds, and then we fit the data set to 9 of those folds, and we test on the left out fold. I can go into details into the nested cross-validation approach, but that is very similar to classic cross-validation with IID samples. So we started with the reversal learning task. So this is a classic task where the agent has 2 actions that they can choose between. The probability of reward that each one of these actions can lead to. One of the actions has a high probability of leading to reward. Another one has a low probability of leading to a reward. And they flip. The action that leads to a high probability of reward flips from one action to the other at a random period throughout the experiment. And we focused on a data set that included almost 10,000 trials from two monkeys. So two monkeys performing this reversal learning task. They had neural recordings as well. Here, we're not going to focus on the neural recordings. We're going to focus on only the behavior. And the key plot that I want you to pay attention to is this plot shown here with lots of dots. And here, what we're seeing are these colored dots that are not blue. They are showing the performance of different types of cognitive models where we're evaluating them in terms of negative log likelihood. This is a better proxy for evaluating probabilistic models than something like accuracy, for example, since accuracy would require an exact prediction. So we use negative log likelihood, where lower is better. And the x-axis here is giving us a key quantity over which we evaluate the different models, which is the number of dynamical variables that they assume. So I want to go back to this figure very quickly to show that, as we said, cognitive models and neural networks are very parallel to one another. The cognitive models are specified by a set of internal belief variables, and we say that they have D variables, and we're going to compare cognitive models with neural networks when both of them have the same number of D variables. Often when I get to this point of the talk, of presentation, some people raise a question, which is that, isn't it obvious that the neural network will explain more variance in the data? Because obviously the neural network has a lot more parameters. So don't we have to compare the neural networks with the cognitive models in terms of how many parameters they have? That's the classic approach that we do model comparison with in statistics, where we compare models with equal number of variables. So the answer is that is the right framework with which to compare models if you're not doing cross-validation. If you're actually doing cross-validation, namely if you're evaluating the quality of your model in a completely separate set, then you don't have to compare them in terms of the exact number of parameters that they have. And it is expected, and here it's exactly the assumption that we have, that the neural network will be more flexible. Of course, the neural networks may still overfit, and if they overfit, they will perform worse in the test set. But if they don't overfit and they're capturing something real about the training data, then they should outperform the cognitive model. And the space over which we compare them are different models with the same number of dynamical variables. And so namely for us, the number of dynamical variables, which is the number of scalar quantities that the model assumes to exist. So this D is essentially how many scalars, how many numbers do we believe that the animal is keeping in their minds as they're performing this task. So we can imagine like a reversal learning task. A Bayesian inference model, we're calling here this model latent state. We later changed them. It's literally a Bayesian inference model. A Bayesian inference model only has one variable that it's keeping track of. It's essentially at every moment the model is estimating what is by belief over which is the best action to take at this time. Therefore, it shows up here. And the quality of this Bayesian inference model is up here in comparison to an RNN that also has a single state variable. And the difference is that the RNN can update the state variable via update functions that are not Bayesian inference. They are variations or modifications over Bayesian inference. So we see that a Bayesian inference model, even though it's often used to explain behavior in a reversal learning task, doesn't do as good a job as an RNN does. A model-free model is also another class of models that is often used to explain behavior in the reversal learning task, does a much better job at explaining the behavior of the monkeys in this task, but still not as good as a one-unit RNN in this task. And as we look over the entire space of dynamical variables, we see that the RNNs always outperform the cognitive models with the same number of variables, unsurprisingly, because again, they have much more flexibility. So is there a question?
Yeah, Marcelo, I have a question.
Yeah.
So the dynamical variables are not equivalent, right, to the free parameters, what we call free parameters in our cognitive models, right?
That's right. Thank you for asking this question again. They're different, and this difference is extremely important to emphasize. So I will go back to this figure just one more time. And I'll emphasize that if you have a one dynamical variable RNN, it actually has only one HT here. So this HT, so you're in this regime here, this HT is updated by these three input variables. And this single variable HT is not even a vector in this case, then will give rise to the policy at the end. However, sorry, I'll go back here again. This f function here is going to be parameterized by on the order of 20 parameters. And this is what confers the RNN so much more flexibility. So the number of free parameters is in fact approximately 20 for a 1 unit RNN. So if you compare that to a cognitive model like a Bayesian inference model has only one parameter, which is the softmax temperature. Conversely, a neural network has about 20 parameters. So the number of free parameters is truly massively different between a neural network and a cognitive model. Is that clear?
Yeah, so here your point about the overfitting and then the cross-validation comes into play, right?
That's
So
right.
although you
Exactly.
have many more free parameters, it still can fail due to overfitting.
Yes, admittedly, we're fitting like a complex function that will map observed variables onto policy. It's a complex function that requires 20 parameters to be specified. And the machine learning approach would say, I don't care what function is being fit because I predict behavior better with this model. But we're going to show that despite using 20 parameters and having a complex function, we can still kind of interpret this. This is going to come a little bit later.
Okay.
But yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, so just for comparison, yes.
Hey, Marcelo. I have a question about the cross-validation part. So, how do you ensure that the whole, different separations you do are indeed independent? Like, could there be, there is something that is correlated between the different parts, but will not generalize, I don't know, to the behavior in the following day?
Can you expand a little bit on this?
So like you slice the behavior to 10 parts and you say that one part is the training set and the other is the test set. But could it be that there are some kind of, associations between the train and the test where you're not necessarily generalizing to an independent kind of test set, but you're just taking the noise from the training set, which is also the noise in the test set. And if you look at the monkey the other day, the noise will be different, kind of like it's not something that would generalize to the monkey behavior in general.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. That was like a major concern in this approach as well. Like, can we test this nested cross-validation approach every single way to make sure it's not soaking up, it's not kind of learning some spurious variable that enables it to predict out of sample behavior? And we did lots of things. For example, we tried to predict only trials that are directly not adjacent. So we removed as well from the training set anything that was even like 100 trials adjacent. We tried to I forget exactly. We had like more than 20 supplementary figures in the paper to try to address all possible ways in which we could kind of see any kind of leakage of signal there. I mean, it's in the end, it's a little bit difficult to rule out 100%. For us, what we did was, our focus was more like, can we find patterns in the data using this model that we can show to be predictive of behavior, like interpretable patterns that if we can then kind of even design from the ground up a cognitive model using those features that we obtained from the neural networks, are they still kind of predictive of behavior? And the answer was yes. But if you have any thoughts on this, I think for time series, this was also my main concern as well. And by the end, I got convinced that this was a pretty clean approach.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, so for comparison here, the ideal observer model sits here. We found that the predictive performance for the RNNs peaked for a D equals 2. I want to just emphasize, and by the way, I'm kind of going slowly and focusing on this plot because this is really kind of, once we understand this, the other ones are going to be much more easy to understand as well. But one thing that was quite remarkable here is that the predictive performance peaked for D equals 2, for 2 dynamical variables. That means that if we used an RNN with 10 units, which in turn had many more parameters, approximately 400 parameters or free parameters that we fit to the data, that larger network did not have a greater predictive power than a smaller RNN. And this tells us 2 things. First, that overfitting is truly a concern, that if you fit a very large RNN, eventually you're going to overfit and you're going to have a lower performance on your cross-validated set. Great. So at least it's not the case that just using larger and larger networks, we always get better prediction. But the second thing that we learned from this is that what can we say about the fact that the number of variables is 2? This was interesting because there's been other work in the literature that says that you can behavior, even for the same task, different individuals performing the same task can exhibit behavior of different dimensionality. And we can estimate the dimensionality of behavior as the number of functions that we need to specify of the past that enables us to predict future behavior. So these RNNs, that when you look at this line, the point at which this line is lowest, that has the highest predictive performance, actually gives us a proxy for the dimensionality of behavior. And in the case of these monkeys, the fact that the lowest value was 2, this is one specific this is the average across 2 monkeys. It actually suggests that these monkeys are likely maintaining in mind 2 internal variables as they perform this task, 2 scalar variables.
3, right? Because it's quite the same, right?
So 3 is very similar as well. So 3, 2 or 3. That's right. Yeah, I think it's fair to say 2 or 3. One thing to say about this is we do not believe, and in fact, almost every investigation that we've done with more complex tasks will show higher dimensionality of behavior. So this tiny RNN approach is particularly well suited for very simple tasks, such as a reversal learning task, where a 2-unit RNN is not only better than a cognitive model, but indeed is the best model we could find for the behavior of these monkeys. So this is great, because if we can then interpret this 2-unit RNN, then we have the cake and eat it too. Like, it's both well predictive and interpretable. However, we do not expect this to be valid for all tasks. But fortunately, the field of cognitive science has focused so much, and neuroscience has focused so much on these extremely simple tasks for, often experimentalists need to control for so many variables that they use very simple tasks. So it's still the case that so many of the tasks classically used in the field can be analyzed with very small neural networks and still soak up all of the variance. If it were the case that we needed a larger neural network, we can still use a smaller network to explain the behavior in those tasks, except that we need to accept that the smaller network would not be explaining everything that is explainable in the behavior. Yeah, so yes.
So can you, I don't know enough about neural network, but so when you say you have 20 parameters, this is because although you have only 2 units, each one of these units is connected to past decisions. So one of the difference between what you do in traditional and simple model-free reinforcement learning is that you're not only affected by some running average, but you also maybe in trial 21 will be influenced what happened in trial 15?
Yeah, so one detail I didn't mention is that if these RNNs were what's called vanilla RNNs, the number of parameters that you would need for a 2-unit RNN would not be 20, would be maybe 5 or so. The reason why for us it's 20 is because we use a variant of a neural network. And again, for us, it doesn't matter the specific type as long as we have 2 state variables or D state variables.
So what are
But
the
for us,
inputs?
we use a GRU. Yeah, I think I'm going to answer your question. So the parameters in a GRU actually specify at each moment which information do you want to retain from the last hidden state and which information do you want to discard. So you actually have this reset and update gates in a GRU that are each specified by a few free parameters. So they basically learn, like, depending on the current input, what information do I want to discard and which information do I want to retain. So they end up actually being able to have very flexible update rules. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes.
I'm happy to. I should look for I should have an equation with a slide with the equation exactly, but yeah, but essentially these classes of gated RNNs, they contain this gates, and the gates basically specify there are separate functions that you're learning. They specify depending on each kind of input, what information do you want to discard from your previous hidden state and which information do you want to retain from the previous hidden state. Which is in fact what allowed these types of networks. Another type is LSTM. You may have heard the long-term, short-term memory.
But can I assume that the parameters are related to memory kind of thing? So you have to remember more past experience than what that model-free reinforcement learning is remembering.
Yeah. So these gated RNNs, they've been developed in the field precisely to enable you to learn long, like, information that had been presented a long time ago, and to kind of solve or partially solve what's called the vanishing gradient problem. The fact that if you took a vanilla RNN and you trained that in a language task, it wouldn't work well because the word you're trying to predict at the end of the sentence depends on something that has happened a few paragraphs ago. So those long range dependencies are, yeah.
Yeah. So in that respect, it's more similar to the Plonsky et al. Paper that we can show that model-free reinforcement learning is too simple to capture.
That's right.
Wavy recency effect and stuff. So
That's
your
right.
model will capture the wavy recency effect.
I think so. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move forward because I'm a little bit running out of time. So to the reversal learning task, the predictive performance peaks at 2 units. We can then look at whether these RNNs reproduce behavioral patterns that are known. For example, how quickly a monkey switches their preferences after a reversal. So the data in the RNN shows very similar patterns. We can then look at different tasks. In the 2-stage task, we again see that these RNNs, for all number of units, outperform all of the classic cognitive models, regardless of the variance of those models. They also reproduce classical behavioral patterns like the state probability. If you're familiar with the 2-stage task, you certainly have heard of this state probability plots that show whether an animal is behaving in a model-free or model-based way. If you haven't learned of the 2-stage task, it's okay, and we don't have to focus particularly on this task. And again, in the transition reversal learning task, we found that the RNN outperforms all of the classic cognitive models of equal size. And in the last case, in the 2-stage task, these are 4 rats, and here we have 17 mice. And it doesn't matter which species we're studying, the RNNs are obviously always capable of explaining more of the variance. For the transition reversal 2-stage task, we actually noticed that the optimal dimensionality was between 2 and 4 in this task. Actually, 4 was slightly better, but not significantly better. But we see that as the task gets more complex, unsurprisingly, we need more units to soak up or to explain all of the variance in the behavior. So the key result one here is that these tiny RNNs outperform this 30 classical cognitive models across tasks and reproducing key behavioral metrics from the original study. And the second key result is that the predictive accuracy seems to plateau in those simple tasks, very importantly, only in those tasks, for 1 to 4 units, suggesting that overfitting is still a concern and that the underlying behavior is low dimensional. One question you might ask is, great, this is good because you're studying animal behavior. Animals are not optimal. Animals just cannot do optimal Bayesian inference. For sure, if you had an animal or an individual that was performing Bayesian inference, surely it would be better to use a cognitive model that was designed to capture the optimal behavior like a Bayesian model. And we've seen humans are optimal decision makers in many tasks. So it turns out that if you generate synthetic data from a normative model and then use an RNN, a tiny RNN, to explain or to predict that behavior, so you treat the optimal behavior as if you were generated by an animal, and you use an RNN to fit that behavior, we see that the predictive accuracy of the RNN is as good as the predictive accuracy of the model class that actually generated the data. So it's never worse. And so that means that this RNN can be molded to produce normative behavior as well. And the same is true for both normative behavior from like a Bayesian model or model-based model with one dynamical variable, as well as reinforcement learning models with 2 dynamical variables. We see that the GRU has equal performance as those models. So this suggests that these RNNs perform as well as the ground truth cognitive models, and that they can implement normative behavior, therefore kind of forming like a superset of classical cognitive models. Another important point here will be about data usage. One might wonder, and maybe this is the most important concern one might have, is that if you're learning from data a very complex function with 20, 40, or hundreds of parameters, naturally you're going to need to have a lot more data to fit those parameters. And that's entirely true. So the actual flexibility of the RNNs really is caused by the fact that it has many more free parameters, because this allows it to be molded into a wider range of behaviors. However, it requires more data. So we can see some examples here. So in the monkey reversal learning task, for example, we see that as you increase the number of tries used to fit the models, that a model-free model needs about 200, 300 trials to reach the maximum predictive ability. Like if you have 200 or 2,000 trials, it doesn't really make much, like the model that you fit, the parameters that you get by fitting the models are basically the same, and the held out accuracy, predictive accuracy is the same. This is also the case for a model-free RL model. Maybe you have gains for a little bit longer, all the way to 1,500 trials or so, but eventually it asymptotes. The GRU, on the other hand, you see that if you have a small data set with 200, 400 trials, the GRU actually performs worse than the RL models. And it's only if you have large amounts of data that these models perform better. But they do have this property that as you keep increasing the size of the data set, they continue to get better and better. So like a similar pattern is found, for example, on the transition reversal two-stage task, where the simple models perform better for very small data sets, and the RNN actually needs larger data sets before they start performing better. So given this problem, we saw this as a problem. We saw this as a problem because in our day-to-day lives as cognitive scientists, the data sets that we deal with, they're not massive. They tend to be classically, the way we perform these studies in cognitive science is we fit a simple model to a data set that we collect from one human participant that may include 100 trials, 200 trials, maybe maximum, on the order of 500 trials. And we rely on the fact that we have many subjects to really look at how general are the conclusions that we drew from the models. So again, the typical data set is few trials per subject with many subjects. So we wondered, can we actually do something similar with these RNNs where we fit the data from like little data from each subject, but we rely on the fact that we have many subjects. But again, we want to retain the ability of explaining patterns for individual subjects. And to do that, what we did was we proposed an approach where we feeding data from all subjects, and we just learn from the data which subjects behave similar to one another. If they all behaved exactly identically, we could just kind of treat the large data set as just being a concatenation of the individual subjects' data. Since they don't look quite, if they all behave in a completely unique way, we couldn't do any kind of averaging. But if they behave in a way that is some components of their behavior shareable, then you can use an approach that can maybe kind of learn what parts of the data can be related, can be kind of transferred from one subject to another. I'm showing here the predictive performance of a model-free RL and an RNN that you fit to only one subject. And as we saw, like you need about 3,000 trials for the RNN to start performing better than the model-free RL. But if we actually use what's called a teacher network, this is a large RNN, not a small unit RNN, which receives the input that the subject receives, but also it's told which subject performed this trial. So it receives a series of trials. If you just concatenate the trials from all subjects, but you also provide information about which subject corresponds to which trial, this RNN can still do a really good job at predicting the output, the actions that the subjects did, and it will learn the patterns that are specific to each subject. And we see that this teacher RNN performs now very well relative to the solo RNN. It performs much better because it has data from all subjects.
But
the
Marcelo,
disadvantage is that it's large. Yes.
don't you need to make many assumptions about this new function of similarity between participants? So
Not quite. Essentially, what we're learning here is an embedding space, this E of S here. We can specify the dimensionality of that vector, and we're essentially mapping the subject ID to this embedding space. Let's say it's a two-dimensional space. Now, within each space, 2 points that are close by corresponds to two individuals that make similar decisions. 2 points that are far apart, they correspond to two individuals that make different decisions. And we rely on the fact that this RNN can learn how the subjects map in this space.
So you just need to determine the threshold of close and far away, right?
Even that we don't quite need, because the RNN will learn these functions as well that will map from that space, from that map, onto a prediction of choice. So for example, if it sees two subjects that behave very similarly, it will place these two subjects very close by in the space, and therefore it will kind of treat the choices from the two subjects as if it's coming from the same subject.
Does it weight differently, like according to the distance between subjects? So people that are more closer get higher weight in the calculation than people that are in this dimensional.
Yeah, we can speculate about what the network is doing with that embedding map. What we can see. So again, we're treating this teacher network with many units for us now is a black box. And it will do a good job at kind of discovering what to do about the similarity function to predict choice. And it does a good job, but we're not saying that we have to understand it yet, because there's one further step that we do here, which is then to use this teacher network as a as a new data set to train a small student network. The student network is, again, a tiny network with very few units, where we're going to use it not to train on, let's say, 200 trials from one subject. We're going to use it to train this student network on the data produced by the teacher network, where we're going to ask the teacher network to produce behavior that looks like a particular subject. Like you will, because this teacher network has learned how all individuals behave and how similar they are to one another, it can then produce choices that are characteristic of each individual. And we use these patterns to train the student networks. Now it's a set of student networks. Each one is only trained on patterns that the teacher ascribes to one particular individual. And that in turn allows us to train a small student network, even though the teacher has only seen few trials per subject. This is very analogous if you're familiar with hierarchical Bayesian models in cognitive modeling. This is like a neural network version of that, essentially. And the student network, we can see, performs almost as well as the teacher, despite the fact that it has, I think in this case, 2 units only. With this, I will show very quickly 3 results from human experiments, where all of these human experiments, we have, for example, 160 trials per subject, but 1,000 humans. And we see that the RNN with 1, 2, 3 units always outperform the previously used cognitive models as well. So even though we have very small, reasonably large, reasonably sized data sets, the tiny RNN approach still works well. Similarly, for the 4-arm drifting bandit task, the RNN still perform better. We see here that the number of units you need to explain behavior optimally is much larger. This is because these humans just have more complex behavior, but critically, you only need 150 trials per subject. And finally, in the original 2-stage task as well, 200 trials per subject is enough for the RNN to outperform the cognitive models. So the fourth key result here is that tiny RNNs trained with this knowledge distillation approach, where you use a teacher to train a student, outperform the cognitive models even with 200 trials. So I know we're almost out of time, but I really would like to just very briefly present the interpretability result. Is that okay? Okay, so we end up with this RNN. We now have these RNNs, and if we were classic machine learning scientists, would say, that's great, we have better prediction performance. This is all we care about. But we, cognitive science, we want to understand what's happening. So we can now use dynamical systems tools to interpret these models. Because they're small, they're increasingly more interpretable. So for example, let's take a 1-unit RNN that we fit to the reversal learning task, for example. We can plot a 2D plot where the x-axis is the logit. The logit is a 1-unit variable specifying how much the RNN prefers action A1 versus prefer actions A2. You essentially take that policy and you divide the log of the probability of choosing action A1 by the probability of choosing action A2. So that's the x-axis. The y-axis is how much this logit is changing on a trial-by-trial basis. And we're going to put dots corresponding to trials. So a dot here, for example, corresponds to one trial where the agent or the RNN preferred action A1. And after that trial, that preference did not change because the logit change is 0. So this dot here is one trial where there was a high degree of preference for A1 with no change. A dot here would correspond to the agent is equally ambivalent between actions A1 and A2. There's no preference, but the logit change is negative, which means that at the next trial, the preference would be shifted to A2. So that the next trial would be a new dot that would be further to the left from this one. And a point here, for example, corresponds to a moment, a trial in which the RNN preferred action A2 with a positive logit change, which means that the next time point, the preference for A2 decayed. because the preference for A1 increased, right? Like it's a positive logic change, it moves to the right. So we can now imagine populating a 2D plot like this, where each point corresponds to one trial. And if you did that with a model free RL model, where you also have logits and logit changes, you would have a pattern like this. This pattern indicates that when you prefer, so each color here corresponds to one input. So let's look at A1, the agent chooses action A1 and receives a reward, for example. So these are these dots on the top. So these dots are indicating that if on a given trial, the agent prefers action A2, but it picks action A1 and gets a reward, the logit change is positive. So all of these dots here show that the logit change will be positive, meaning that the preference for action A1 will increase, which is expected given that the action A1 was taken and reward was received. That will happen all the way to this point here where the logit change is equal to 0. And this suggests that this is a point of maximal preference for action A1. It's a fixed point of the system. A model free RL is symmetric relative to A1 and A2. So we see that the dark red colors are exactly equivalent. So these are points, here are points where the agent prefers action A1, but selects action A2 and receives a reward. So these points, they tend to move to the left. And in the middle, we have either action is selected, A1 or A2, with 0 reward being received. If a reward of 0 is received, if the preferred action is A2, it tends to move to the center up until 0 preference. So a fixed point here is 0. Conversely, if the agent prefers action A1 and receives 0 reward in either case, that preference tends to decrease up until the middle. So we see that a model free RL has these 3 fixed points. These are points in which if you got to that point, you would get stuck there, assuming the inputs are the same. Like we have 3 fixed points in the system. Just for comparison, a Bayesian inference model has this pattern that shows that there are only 2 fixed points. It's you either prefer action A1 very much, or either you prefer action A2 very much. There's no point of indifference. A Bayesian inference is never indifferent, a Bayesian inference agent. And the lines are curved in this case, which means that you have maximal learning rate if you have evidence that this confirms your beliefs. You would take me a little bit of time to kind of unpack this. And I'll just show that you can do the same with an RNN. You can take a 1-unit RNN that you fit to the monkey's behavior, and you can then plot on a trial-by-trial basis what preference does the RNN believe that monkey has, and how is that preference changing here in the logit change. And what you end up with is a pattern that you can directly compare with the baseline models, model free Bayesian inference agents. For example, you may count the number of attractors and see where they're positioned. You can look at these lines and see whether they're curved or straight, and so on and so forth. So here in this RNN, we can see that this actually looks a lot more like a Bayesian, like a model free RL agent with 3 fixed points, but with some important differences. For example, we can see that the learning rate is not fixed. The learning rate from these plots can be inferred by the slope of these lines. In a model free RL model, the learning rate is always the same, regardless of which action you took, and regardless of your current belief, your current preference. In the RNN, sometimes for some actions, the learning rates are constant, but in other cases, we see that these curves are curved, which suggests that the learning rate is not constant. It tends to be higher, for example, for action A2, the learning rate tends to be higher if you're in a state where you really prefer action A1 than if you're in a state where you really prefer action A2. You can also find some degree of perseveration. Perseveration is the decoupling of these 2 light lines. And finally, the last thing I'll just mention here is that you can see that these 3 fixed points are not equidistant from the center. That the fixed point for preferring action A1 is further from the center than the fixed point for preferring action A2. So this put very simply says that if you take action A1 and receives rewards repeatedly, you actually end up at a state that you prefer A1 more than if you take action A2 and receives reward repeatedly. Like taking action A2 and receiving repeated rewards will never take you to the same degree of preference as you get from state A1. I think I'm out of time, so I'm just going to say interpretability is really critical, and I hope this gives you a taste for what we can do. And the take-home messages here is that this framework for discovering cognitive algorithms without having to hand design them, that these RNNs predict animal and human choices better than classical cognitive models, that the small scale facilitates the discovery of novel interpretable patterns through these visualizations, and the models can be trained with typically sized data sets and improved with more data. So with that, I will take questions and happy to stay for a few more minutes to discuss these results in more detail.
Thank you. So this is indeed very interesting, and unfortunately our time is running out. So we will end the formal part now, and those who have to go can go now. And I think we will move the questions to the informal part.